today's call is all about looking at our ego and how our ego impacts us as individuals, but also in particular for this call as leaders of organizations. So I hope that what you're going to gain from this call today is some insights around what ego is, how it impacts us, and the way it can sometimes trip us up, but also how it serves us as well. And we're going to do that by looking at some of our ego traps that we all will have experienced at one time or another. Now, I did send out some pre-session reading. I hope you have had the chance to read it. It will help you in the conversation that we have today. If you haven't had a chance to read it, no worries. You can have a look at it afterwards. It will help consolidate the sorts of things that we're talking about today. So let's kick off and explore, first of all, what we mean by ego. So I thought I would check in with each of you, or a couple of you at least, just to find out what your interpretation of ego is. So Donnie, if I say to you, what is ego? What is the thing that comes up for you?
Well, can you hear me okay, Mary?
I can indeed, thank you.
I think it's that thing at the core of you that's, it's not necessarily, I don't always view it as necessarily the positive side of you. Mm-hmm. It's a thing that sees you as being very important.
Yes.
Wants to protect you, but it's got a negative consequence as well. And that's the way I kind of crudely view ego.
Okay, that's a really, really perceptive interpretation, actually. Lucy, have you got any other
I would
that you can
totally
make?
agree with that. I think it's the it's that kind of quite, and as you say, I think can be quite negative, that driver that just goes, I should be doing this, or it's kind of like, it's not it's making you telling you how important you are, when actually it's probably not totally right. I don't know. And it's something I think we do have to be aware of. I know we have to be aware of it.
It's something certainly to be aware of. Sometimes it is about overimportance. Sometimes it also causes us to play small as well. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we look at the ego traps. So to give you a psychological interpretation, and thank you to both of you for that. That was really helpful in terms of what you shared there. Here's a sort of psychological interpretation of what ego is. Ego is actually our survival strategy. It's a psychological survival strategy. And why do we need to have that? Well, in growing up usually, so we've learned our survival strategies, they sort of take their place in our heads or in our bodies or however way they manifest themselves. We kind of learn our survival strategies as children, and they're designed to reduce our social anxiety. So our ego is there to keep us safe and keep us in our comfort zone. And it can be things that make us feel more important, or it can be things that make us feel smaller and where we hide away, is also our ego in action. The other thing about it is we all have one. We might like to think, oh, no, I don't have an ego, but we all can have an ego, and it gets activated at different times and in different places. It's often unconscious. We have a reaction to something, we may have that experience of being triggered by something, and that's where I refer to ego traps, because when we're actually triggered and in reactive mode, it's almost like we're falling into the trap of that old, well-worn survival strategy that maybe served us really well and can serve us in some ways presently, but often within organizations as leaders, it's not often the most helpful way to react in those particular situations. So it doesn't necessarily serve us now. So let's have a look then as to why is ego so important to us as leaders. And to think about this, I've actually been looking at some research from the Gallup survey of 2017, which looked into employee engagement and employee performance and what impacted those different elements. And what was I found quite shocking actually, was to find that 70% of employees at any one time are either just not engaged or they're actively disengaged. And not engaged is kind of, you turn up for work, you do the basics of what you have to do. You're not really that enthralled with the jobs that you're doing or the organization you're working for. Actively disengaged is actually doing things that might be going against the good of the organization on a day-by-day basis. So it could actively negatively impact the organization. And the research then went on to say more about, well, you know, what are people looking for in organizations that will help them feel more engaged? And the things that they're looking for are positive relationships, to feel like they're included and they have a say in things, to feel trusted and like they can trust the people around them, and also to feel safe to be their full selves within the organization. Now, if we're playing on our egos, if our egos are reacting right, left and center, we aren't necessarily going to be behaving in ways that will affect those positive relationships and that psychological safety. So as leaders, we are often role modeling the culture and the atmosphere around us. And that can therefore really impact the level of safety that people feel in the organization, the trust that they have, and the positive relationships that they can create there. So as a leader, it's really important to actually have a sense of what are your ego drives, what are the things that could potentially knock you off your center, as it were, and impact in a negative way, but also what are the things that you do that serve you as well. So I thought we would look into our ego in a bit more detail, and we'd actually look at your ego drives today. And this is a bit of fun, so not to be taken too seriously. It's a quick poll to think about, how does your ego affect you? So I'm going to ask you in a minute 8 different questions. They might take you a bit of thinking about, so you don't need to rush through it in any shape or form. But you're going to have a choice around these different statements. There's 8 different statements. And what I'd like you to think about is, does this describe me? Does it never, ever describe me? I'm never like this. Or am I frequently like this? And then there's 2 options in between as well. So I'm going to launch the poll now and just give you a chance to complete that. I'm now going to share with you what those questions were pertaining to. And as I say, this is light touch. This is not a deep psychological test. It's just to give us a flavor of how our egos can sometimes act up sometimes. So the first set of questions, the first 4, looked at what we call our overinflated ego traps. So when we get caught up by our ego, by our overinflated ego traps, we tend to big ourselves up. We tend to feel more okay and make other people not okay. And the first one pertained to do it now. So it's like, if you're running that ego trap, everything has to be done as quickly as possible and as rushed as possible. You get anxious if you're not in action. And actually often activity is a big distraction for you when you're running that ego trap. Solo flight is all about having to do things on your own. You really have to be very strong. It's not okay to ask for help. You're the sort of people that if you're running that as an ego trap, you may find that you work really, really hard. And then when you go away on holiday, you get ill. So you're holding it all together before you go away, then you have a break and you get really poorly because you've been holding it all together and not necessarily looking after yourself. I'm all right, Jack, if you're running that ego trap. We were doing that often or frequently. That can be an ego trap that indicates a bit of smugness and can come from a place of, actually, I'm okay, I know it all, it's other people that need help, not me. Okay, so that can be that ego trap there. Blaming others is, as the name suggests, is all about shifting the blame onto other people. And it's not about you, it's about others, and your world would be so much better if everybody else could sort themselves out, or if the circumstances didn't show up as they're showing up. So that's our overinflated ones. And then for our underinflated ones, our second group is all about when we play small. So these are our defensive ego strategies that cause us to play smaller than we necessarily are. And number 5, we had a split there: seldom, often, and frequently. I know this is one of mine. I'm a frequent player of this one. Is people pleasing is when we actually give everything to other people. It makes us feel better. It soothes our ego to give to other people, but then we end up losing out because we don't look after ourselves so much, and we find it very difficult to deal with conflict. Never good enough is the perfectionist one. If that's the one that you're running, that is all about always striving for really high standards, but never ever are they going to get good enough. So you end up feeling quite self-judgmental, self-critical, and maybe critical of others because you're never going to be good enough. Rescue Me is all about help me, sort it out. I go into this over technology. You may be aware of that at times, but it's like, I just can't do this. I want someone else just to come and sort it all out for me, and feeling quite helpless and quite victim-y actually when you're in that ego trap. And then being cautious is all about the trap that holds you back, that stops you taking risks, that actually keeps you in your comfort zone, stops you from developing, but does keep you very, very safe. So we have these different ego traps. I've given you a very quick summary. There is more in the pre-reading that I sent through as well. You can go back and have a look at. What I'm curious about is that there are some real merits in these ego traps. We develop them because they're good for us, and they've helped us survive, but there's also pitfalls in them as well. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to split you into two groups, and fortunately Joe has managed to join us as well. So I'm going to put Penny and Joe, I'd like you to look at underinflated ego traps, and Donnie and Lucy, I'd like you to look at overinflated ego traps. And in your groups, I'd like you to just to think about, well, what do we get out? Just if we're being overinflated, any of these traps, what might we get out of them? But then also, what's the downside of that? How can they limit or hinder us as leaders? And while you're in your groups, I'll pop into your breakout rooms and just see how you're getting on. But I'm going to just send you off into your breakout rooms now. Okay, welcome back. So I hope you enjoyed the discussions that you were having in there. It certainly sounded like there were some really good conversations going on there. So I'd just like to check in with each of the groups just to see what was coming through in terms of how that any of those traps might serve us and how they might hinder us. So Donnie, if I could ask you to share from your group around overinflated ego traps, can you share one thing that how they might serve us and one thing in how they might limit us?
Well, we do it now. Sometimes the circumstance is that it should be done now, and there shouldn't be any delay to it. But if that's your only mechanism, that everything needs to be done now, then there's going to be a lot of circumstances where it's not appropriate. And it's trying to judge, is it contextually right to be doing this right now and quickly, or is it not? And I guess you've got to put your ego to one side to maybe be able to make that decision. That's what we were talking, one of the things we talked about. That's
great. Yes, absolutely. So organizations do need things doing, and leaders are there to make that happen. So absolutely having that as a drive is going to be helpful, but if it's overdone, it can become quite coercive and also cause a lot of stress, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving on to group 2, Penny, if you'd like to share some of the things, or one of the things that you and Lucy discussed around an ego trap that served you, but also how it can hinder you.
So people pleasing, I definitely would go down as a people pleaser, but I think it can create quite a lot of resentment when you're in an environment where other people will take too much from you and you start exhausting yourself. So I think it's nice to be a people pleaser because it makes you quite likable, but I think sometimes it can take away so much of your energy and can create that atmosphere of, why aren't people being like me?
Yes, it can create a certain resentment. It also can lead to burnout because you're taking care of other people so much and you're not necessarily looking after yourself. So definitely one to keep an eye on. Thank you so much. Lucy, was there anything else you wanted to add there?
Sorry, no, that because I'm a great people pleaser and do it now. So
yes.
You've summed up.
You can relate to both of those, yeah. That's great. I love the fact because our ego can be overinflated or underinflated. It's not exclusive to each one. Although people do say that quite often in gender differences, overinflated is what shows up in the workplace for men, and underinflated shows up in the workplace for women, which is quite interesting. But I don't know whether that's generalized throughout the world completely. Anyway, let's move on and just sum up the things that we've covered today, which is that we all have an ego. It is our survival strategy. So it's something about, we can be very demeaning about our ego, but we do have it there for a reason. It is to look after ourselves. And maybe there's learning to get from that as to what is it protecting us from. It is unconscious often, and we have our ego traps which influence our feelings, thoughts and behavior. And then how we behave as leaders actually impacts the level of engagement and performance in the workplace, which is why it's so important that as leaders we become aware of our egos and how we manage them. Our ego can serve us, as we've all pointed out today, but when it's reactionary or if it's overplayed, it can hinder us, and it can certainly hinder the relationships we have with others. And building awareness around our ego traps can give us a really good first step actually in how to manage ourselves and how to build up those sort of muscles that help us be less ego driven when we're actually performing as leaders. So that kind of brings us to the end of our session today. Next time we have got future sessions coming up, and we're going to be looking more at exploring the triggers. So those are the things that press your button and you're off and your ego's, you're in full flight of ego, as it were, and how to manage that. And we'll be looking at some strategies around that, but we'll also be moving into thinking about how do you navigate other people's egos? And that's thinking about the people that you might influence, your stakeholders, the people that you're working with who are part of your team, and also the people that you might be reporting to as well. So how to navigate those egos too. So one final thing to say before we finish is, if you want to find out more, you can read a lot more in my book, which is out soon, called Ego, Get Over Yourself and Lead, because a lot of this is about getting over ourselves. I would like to thank you so much for your participation today. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I've certainly enjoyed working with you. Thank you so much.